So we have had a fair idea of what detective fiction is and how detective fiction functions. What we will discuss today
স্যার
is,
হ্যালো
uh,
স্যার আমি শুভশ্রী পাল বিএ থার্ড ইয়ার থেকে
বলো,
হ্যাপি টিচার্স ডে স্যার
Happy
Happy-
Teachers Day, sir.
thank you,
Happy Teachers Day, sir.
thank you very
Teachers
much,
Day,
all
sir.
of you. All right.
Happy Teachers Day.
Thank you. Right. Now, it feels so good to be back in a class on Teachers' Day. Let me say how happy I am to be part of this class. Right. Okay. So we talked about the ways in which the rules of detective fiction, according to Van Dyne. We have also talked about the ways in which the structure of detective fiction has evolved. And we have also talked about the rules of the detective club that Agatha Christie actually, with her co-writers, was trying to inculcate. Now, what I'll try and do today is discuss the text of Agatha Christie's Roger Ackroyd, at least the first parts. It কেন করছি আমি? Because I think at the undergraduate level, even though this is a novel, I need to draw your attention to certain parts of the text and make comments on the way in which specifically Agatha Christie creates a milieu and a detective of her own. আমি তোমাদের একটা জিনিস বলেছিলাম that detective fiction is extremely stereotypical in the sense that it follows a certain structure. What I'm going to try and show today is how within that structure, Agatha Christie sort of tries to create horizontal differences in order that her detective fiction is unique in a certain respect. Now, this novel, of course, and I hope you have sort of read this, and I will start off with a spoiler, is that you will find that there is no narrator friend of the detective here. There's no Watson. The Watson here is played by a man called Dr. Shepherd, who incidentally turns out to be the murderer of Roger Ackroyd. So, who killed Roger Ackroyd? The answer is Dr. Shepherd. And Dr. Shepherd is the narrator. So, what Agatha Christie is doing is fundamentally violating the first precept of detective fiction, that the narrator or the detective should not be the murderer. So, this is a radical departure, one. Secondly, because it is a doctor, have you wondered, the friend is often a writer or a doctor, Dr. Watson, Captain Hastings, Ajit is a writer in Bomkesh. Now, what this means is a certain degree of precision and also a minute kind of observatory style that Agatha Christie can sort of draw upon. Now, the point remains that if the murderer is the narrator, or if the narrator is the murderer, then he or she becomes fundamentally what Wayne C. Booth, B-O-O-T-H, Wayne হচ্ছে W-A-Y-N-E, Wayne C. Booth calls an unreliable narrator. Unreliable narrator কেন? Because the narrator is speaking at a certain level, right? Narrator একটা কথা বলছেন, right? কিন্তু তার সবসময় দুটো মানে রয়েছে. There are two meanings to every statement that the narrator makes, because he is ultimately the murderer, right? So you have to understand this, that, in a certain way, the fun of the text or the pleasure of the text or the reversal of the text, whatever you call it, lies in the fact that Agatha Christie is taking you for a ride, that at every level, wherever Dr. Ferris is stating, Dr. Shepherd is making a statement, this statement is double-edged. There's a inner meaning within it. এই জায়গাগুলো কিন্তু আমি তোমাদের একটু দেখাতে চাই, so that you understand what an unreliable narrator is. Reliable narrator is somebody there is no gap in the narration and the information, right? সে যা বলছে তাই 110% true, বাট আনরিলায়েবল ন্যারেটরের মধ্যে সে যা বলছে আর তার যা মানে তার মধ্যে দের ইজ আ ক্রুশিয়াল অ্যামাউন্ট অফ ডিফারেন্স। এটা তোমাদের মাথায় রাখতে হবে কিন্তু সবসময়, রাইট? when you go and look at the narrations of very different kinds of people, you'll find third person omniscient narration ওপর থেকে দেখানো হচ্ছে, সুতরাং সেখানে সেটা নিয়ে প্রবলেম নেই। This is a first person narration, right? And therefore what information is given and what the meaning is to be is different here, and that is why I use, or rather Wayne C. Booth uses the term unreliable. Okay, now if you look at the text, and I am projecting it there, the story starts off with actually two deaths, one death, and then ends up with the murder of Roger Ackroyd. Mrs. Ferrers is the wealthy woman who has settled in King's Abbot. King's Abbot is the village to which I will come in a moment. Mrs. Ferrers has settled in King's Abbot. Her husband has died a year ago, almost a year and 9 days on the day Roger Ackroyd is murdered. And she is in the village finds her in a romantic liaison with Roger Ackroyd. So they're supposed to be very close and probably going to get married. And then Mrs. Ferrers commits suicide. অর্থাৎ এটা ভালো করে প্লটের স্ট্রাকচারটা বুঝে নাও। মিসেস ফেরার্স সুইসাইড দিয়ে শুরু হচ্ছে। মিসেস ফেরার্সের হাজবেন্ড হ্যাজ 1 বছর আগে মারা গেছেন, এবং there is a suggestion that he has been poisoned. Mrs. Ferrers is hobnobbing with Mr. Ackroyd, and then Mrs. Ferrers dies. So it's a very dramatic start to the story. The story starts off with one death. I opened the front door with my latchkey and purposely delayed for a few moments in the hall. To tell the truth, I was considerably upset and worried. দেখো, এই জায়গাটা হচ্ছে unreliable narration. I'm not going to pretend that at the moment I foresaw the events of the next few weeks. I emphatically did not do so. But my instinct told me that there were stirring times ahead. কেন আমি unreliable বলছি? Because Dr. Shepherd is the person who had been blackmailing Mrs. Ferrers. কেন? Dr. Shepherd knew that Mrs. Ferrers had murdered her husband, and therefore he was blackmailing her with this information. এটা যখন তুমি জানবে, তখন, to tell the truth, I was considerably upset and worried. এটা একটা মানে হতে পারে I was upset and worried because she had committed suicide. আরেকটা মানে হতে পারে যে I was upset and worried because the source of my income was gone, and if he had told anybody else, if she had told anybody else, অন্য কাউকে যদি বলে দিয়ে থাকে, তাহলে আমার ঘোরতর বিপদ। But my instinct told me that there were stirring times ahead. বুঝতে পারলে যে এই কথাটার দুটো মানে আছে, কিন্তু এই জন্য একে বলা হয় আনরিলায়েবল ন্যারেটর। এই মজাটা তোমাকে বুঝতে হবে যে আলটিমেটলি আগাথা ক্রিস্টি কিন্তু তোমাকে বোকা বানাচ্ছে। শেষে গিয়ে যখন ডক্টর শেফার্ড খুনি দেখা দেবেন, তখন you will come back to the story and find that all these comments that were made had different meanings. অন্য একটা দ্বিতীয় মানেও ছিল। বুঝতে পেরেছো? এই স্ট্র্যাটেজিটা দেখে নেওয়াটা is a very important part of reading the text, right? Now, therefore, and then there is of course the sister of Dr. Shepherd, Caroline, যাকে অনেকে বলেছেন is the future Miss Marple in the Miss Marple stories, একটা মডেল হিসেবে, who is inquisitive, who is middle-aged, tending towards old, and therefore interested in gossip. এই gossip নিয়ে আমি আরেকটু পরে তোমাদের সঙ্গে I'll have a chat, but right now I will move on to the next part of the discussion. Right. Let me just stop here for a moment and maybe, okay, anyways. So you see, once again, I was talking about the village and the village politics and gossip. I will come to that in a moment. Mrs. Ferrers, of course, was a very attractive woman, and her clothes, though simple, always seemed to fit her well. So Agatha Christie is creating a picture of the woman who has just committed suicide. And then Dr. Shepherd says she died of an overdose of Veronal. Must have taken it too much. Nonsense, said Caroline immediately. She took it on purpose. Why on earth should Mrs. Ferrers wish to commit suicide? Asks the doctor. Remorse. She poisoned her husband. I'm more than ever convinced of it now. এখানে একটু আমি তোমাদের একটু বলে নিই, সেটা হচ্ছে এই যে small places like the country where the number of people are very finite are abuzz with gossip. আরেকটা জিনিস মাথায় রেখো যে এই সমস্ত জায়গায় তো কিছু সেই অর্থে করার থাকে না, সুতরাং as any of you who have stayed in a village will know যে হাড়ির খবর লোকে নিতে চেষ্টা করে, even at শান্তিনিকেতন maybe, small places tend to be places where gossip is more prevalent, and gossip is in a certain way a source of information. আর এই gossip কিভাবে হয়? Gossip হয় through the invisible persons. এটা তোমাদের মাথায় রাখতে হবে. Who are the invisible persons? The maids in your house, the driver of your car, in front of whom you can converse very lightly, very freely. তো যাদেরকে আমরা ধরি না, যাদেরকে আমরা ধর্তব্যের মধ্যে আনি না, তাদের থ্রু দিয়েই there is an elaborate structure of information, as Agatha Christie will repeatedly suggest. প্রত্যেকটা গল্পেই প্রায় রয়েছে the importance of the maid. এই গল্পে অতটা নেই, কিন্তু the maid is an important source of gossip because maids talk to maids and then the other maids talk to the house owners. So একটা ইনফরমেশন সোর্স রয়েছে। আচ্ছা, আরেকটা জিনিস হচ্ছে যে আগাথা ক্রিস্টি অনেক সময় এটা বলবে যে এই ইনফরমেশন সোর্সটা খুব একটা ইনকারেক্ট নয়। There's a very famous proverb that she uses repeatedly, where there is smoke, there is fire. সুতরাং এটা কেন ইম্পর্টেন্ট? এটা ইম্পর্টেন্ট এই নভেলটার ক্ষেত্রে নয় স্পেসিফিক্যালি, বাট উইথ মিস মার্পল নভেলস। মিস মার্পল একজন বয়স্কা ডিটেকটিভ, একা থাকেন, ভেরি ফ্রেল ওম্যান। তার কাছে তো সোর্স অফ ইনফরমেশনটা আসতে হবে। সো দ্য মেইডস আর দ্য সোর্স অফ দিস ইনফরমেশন। এই গসিপের কোয়ালিটি অ্যান্ড পাওয়ারটাকে আগাথা ক্রিস্টি ইজ অলওয়েজ ট্রাইং টু এমফাসাইজ। এবার তোমরা আমাকে জিজ্ঞাসা করতে পারো একভাবে যে why does Agatha Christie write these kinds of novels? কেন শহুরে ডিটেকটিভ নয় কেন? আপনি তো বলেছিলেন যে the detective fiction is essentially an urban genre. এখন দেখো, Agatha Christie had no access to urban crime. বুঝতে পেরেছো? উনি তো শখের ডিটেকটিভ লেখক ছিলেন। Therefore, she read about crime from the newspapers, which she put into practice. Otherwise, she had to create a new milieu where the crime would be committed. একটা নিজস্ব স্পেস তৈরি করতে হবে। এই স্পেসগুলো কি কি হতে পারে? আগাথা ক্রিস্টি একটা বাড়ি ছিল, she had a mansion at Torquay. এই টর্কওয়ে হচ্ছে সমুদ্রের ধারে একটা বাগান বাড়ি ছিল। সে বাগান বাড়িতে আমি গিয়ে দেখে এসেছি। ইনফ্যাক্ট সাম অফ দ্য নভেলস আর situated in that house at Torquay. So as a woman, she did not have access to the spots of crime. শহরের ক্রিমিনাল অঞ্চলে তো তার কোনো পদার্পণ ছিল না। Therefore, she had to create her own space where the crimes would be committed. And these would be the small villages. এখানে কিন্তু একটা জিনিস তোমাদের মাথায় রাখতে হবে সবাই, সেটা হচ্ছে আগাথা ক্রিস্টি এটা যখন বলছেন তখন এটাকে কিভাবে জাস্টিফাই করবে যে এই ভিলেজেসে মার্ডার হচ্ছে, ভিলেজেসে পয়জনিং হচ্ছে। She will justify it by suggesting that human nature is almost everywhere the same. অর্থাৎ মানুষের প্রকৃতি শহরে এবং গ্রামে একই রকম হতে পারে। whether you agree with it or not is a different issue. কিন্তু তোমাদের এটা মেনে নিতে হবে যে আগাথা ক্রিস্টি নভেলের জন্য আগাথা ক্রিস্টি will draw upon a small village. There will be a certain kind of characters in Agatha Christie's novels are a upper middle class, upper classই বলতে পারো, the aristocracy তার মধ্যেই তার আনাগোনা ছিল, right? She mixed amongst this crowd, therefore she chose as the milieu of her novels this kind of a background. এটা কিন্তু আমাদের দেখে নিতে হবে, right? Okay, now so Caroline immediately says she took it on purpose, and Dr. Shepherd sort of tries to counter this, rushing along with rhyme or reason. Why on earth should Mrs. Ferrers wish to commit suicide? Remorse for killing her husband, as it were. And then comes this comment, এখানে যদি দেখো আমার কার্সারটা 10-1, she's left a letter confessing everything, right? এবং এইটাই কিন্তু ডক্টর শেফার্ডের আনইজের কারণ, because indeed Caroline has left a letter, and that letter is to Roger Ackroyd, and because Dr. Shepherd comes to the house when that letter is delivered, he has to kill Roger Ackroyd so that his identity is not revealed. So Roger Ackroyd is not murdered because of any animosity, but he's murdered because it is to him that Mrs. Ferrers had written this letter. সুতরাং তোমরা বুঝতে পারছো যে এই স্টোরিতে the role of the dead Mrs. Ferrers is an extremely crucial role, and that is why the novel has to begin with her death. আচ্ছা, এইবারে দেখো, this is chapter 2, right? And then Agatha Christie writes, our village, King's Abbot, is very much like another village. এগুলো কিন্তু generic villages, English villages, ছোট্ট ছোট্ট ভীষণ সুন্দর, and you have a large railway station which is at the center of the village, a small post office, which is a very important part of Agatha Christie's world, the post office, because এই সময়, of course, you have the telegram, the telegraph, you do not have email or internet. 2 rival general stores, and this village is not filled with able-bodied young men. It is filled with older persons. Why? Because most of them have either gone off to the war or they have gone off to the cities to make their livings. But we are rich. A gram kintu, Englander gram kintu, not the village of আমাদের গ্রাম। এখানে কিন্তু these are only settled people can live in villas, right? So, and rich in unmarried ladies are retired military officers who have retired from the army, who've gone to the Orient, come back, and therefore have a rich repository of experience. Military officers are a part and parcel of Agatha Christie's world, retired colonial officials. Our hobbies and recreations can be summed up in one word: gossip, right? So, interest, a fascinating voyeuristic interest in other people's lives is something that these villages thrive on, according to Agatha Christie, and it is through this that the village detectives can get their source of knowledge. So there are 2 important houses. One is Mrs. Ferrers, and the other is, of course, Roger Ackroyd's, right? Who is Roger Ackroyd? Ackroyd is an immensely successful manufacturer of wagon wheels. সুতরাং এটা মাথায় রেখো, Mrs. Ferrers বা Ackroyd এরা কেউই কিন্তু they are not aristocrats in that sense of the term. They are the upper middle class industrialists who have retired and have therefore come to the village for bought property and come to the village. So changing structures of the English village is something that Agatha Christie is also looking at, right? Is generous. He fell in love and married a beautiful woman who's died, and therefore Ackroyd is somebody who's unmarried and willing to marry, right? So Mrs. Ferris only came to live here just a year ago, and halo of gossip has surrounded Ackroyd for many years past. And then, of course, there's this red herring, তোমাদের যে বলেছিলাম, যে who is the supposed murderer, a Ralph Patton, the stepson of Roger Ackroyd, who is a young, handsome man who does not have any real job, who is very dashing and flirtish, and who is an obvious suspect when Ackroyd dies, because Ackroyd's property will apparently proceed to Ralph Patton. Right. Okay, so we have talked about this, and then Ackroyd meets Dr. Shepherd and says, just the man I wanted to get hold of. This is a terrible business. His cheeks have seemed to have fallen in, and he looked a positive wreck of his usual jolly, healthy self. এটা কেন? Because Mrs. Ferrers had already confessed that she had murdered the husband and she was being blackmailed. She did not disclose the identity of the blackmailer. সুতরাং এটা ভেবে দেখো যে রজার অ্যাক্রয়েড কেন ইমোশনাল রেক, কারণ যে মহিলাকে সে ভালোবাসতো, হি হ্যাজ সাডেনলি ফাউন্ড আউট যে সে একজনকে খুন করেছে এবং তাকে কেউ একজন ব্ল্যাকমেইল করছে। সো Ackroyd is in a state of nervous disorder, right? Look here, I've got to talk to you. Can you come back with me now? And Ackroyd and Dr. Shepherd cannot come back immediately. Strategically, fictionের জন্যে, he has to come back only when the letter is delivered, right? Okay. And then, of course, there is the maid, Miss Russell, the housekeeper, who comes to his study and talks about a poison which nobody else has found and drugs, right? And therefore, there is also another suspicion. এটা হচ্ছে আরেকটা red herring, because there is Miss Russell's son who will be one of the suspects, Charles Kent, who will be one of the suspects, who was seen at that point of time in that house when Roger Ackroyd was murdered, right? So মানে ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশনে একটা জিনিস লক্ষ্য রাখো, ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশনে অথরকে কি করতে হবে, যে কতগুলো সাসপেক্ট তৈরি করতে হবে, রাইট? সাসপেক্ট তৈরি করতে হবে। এইভাবেই কিন্তু থ্রু দিস randomly supposedly innocent questions, there is the suggestion that there are multiple suspects in the story. কেন না, একটা সাসপেক্ট হলে তো তুমি তোমার বুদ্ধির খেলাটা লাগাতে পারবে না। You cannot play the game with the detective, right? You have to have multiple suspects, out of which logically you have to choose the correct murder, right? So this is how the suspects are gradually being built up. এইবারে আসছি চ্যাপ্টার 4, and this is a very important chapter according to me, where Hercule Poirot is introduced. মাথায় রেখো, Hercule কিন্তু Hercule, Poirot Poirot. Poirot is Belgian, of course. আর এই Herculeর সঙ্গে there is this play on Hercules. তোমরা তো বুঝতেই পারছো, Hercules, the mythical superhero. আচ্ছা, in fact, there is a collection of stories of Hercule Poirot titled The 12 Labors of Hercules. আচ্ছা, এখানে দেখো Hercules কিরকম হিরো ছিলেন। He was the strong man, the superman of classical fiction, classical mythical hero হিসেবে Hercules was so powerful that he could lift and keep the entire world on his shoulders. তোমরা জানো, one of the labors of Hercules, he sort of unleashed a river and changed the course of a river through his physical prowess, defeated the Nemean lion. সুতরাং সুপারহিরো। আচ্ছা, Hercule Poirot কিরকম সুপারহিরো তোমাদের বলেছি, is the cerebral superhero, who is superhero, the detective, because of his intellectual power, of his rational ability. And he's also a superhero because he is the avenger of justice. মানে Hercule Poirot কিন্তু never lets the criminal rest in peace. He will bring justice to its logical end. অর্থাৎ সেই দিক থেকে morally and penally, Hercule Poirot is as much, Agatha Christie says, a superhero as Hercules. বুঝতে পেরেছো? এই জন্য এই প্লেটা তোমাদেরকে একটুখানি আমি অ্যাওয়্যার করে দিলাম। আচ্ছা, আরেকটা জিনিস তোমাদের লক্ষ্য রাখতে হবে। তোমরা এরকম জিজ্ঞাসা করতেই পারো যে আগাথা ক্রিস্টি কেন, why did he take a Belgian as a detective? Right? You see, আবার আমি বলছি, to all detective fictions are more or less similar. So you have to have a distinguishing trait of the detective, একটা ইউনিকনেস। এই ইউনিকনেসটাকে আগাথা ক্রিস্টি কিভাবে আনছে? Agatha Christie is introducing an outsider to society. Outsider মানে বিদেশি। So with a funny accent, with a bald pate, মানে মাথায় একটা চকচকে টাক আছে, and fabulous mustaches, অর্থাৎ একজোড়া মানে একটা দুর্ধর্ষ গোঁফ আছে। এই গোঁফটা কিন্তু মাথায় রেখো is a very continental phenomenon, right? সুতরাং আগাথা ক্রিস্টি এমন একজন ডিটেকটিভকে তৈরি করবেন যে ডিটেকটিভ would be extremely, what I'll call, identifiable, extremely unique. So এই ইউনিকনেসটাকে আনার জন্যেই আগাথা ক্রিস্টি is inventing this figure of the outsider, Hercule Poirot, right? এটা মাথায় রেখো কিন্তু always. So there's a certain, আরেকটা জিনিস বলা উচিত, there's a certain comic element about Poirot, right? He's very unlike a sleuth. একদমই শার্লক হোমসের মতো নয় কিন্তু। You please remember this, that all these writers were writing in the shadow of Conan Doyle. অর্থাৎ শার্লক হোমস was such a phenomenon, এবং তোমাদের মনে আছে কিনা জানি না, that actually একটা গল্পে in the initial sections Conan Doyle had killed off Sherlock Holmes. He had died with Moriarty, and he had to bring him back to life. So popular was Holmes, right? So to make his detective distinguished from Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie had to create a slightly comical, not at all physical, a foreigner with a funny accent, a detective with a difference, and that would be Hercule Poirot. But essentially, Hercule is Hercules, in the sense that he will bring all criminals to justice with a superb facility of the brain, right? And then, of course, you see, Hercule Poirot throws a marrow at the garden of the shepherds and breaks into, so an egg-shaped head, এই জায়গাটা একটু ভীষণভাবে important, partially covered with suspiciously black hair, two immense moustaches, and a pair of watchful eyes. It was our mysterious neighbor, Mr. Poro, right? And then they are speculating, who is this Poro, right? His name is apparently Mr. Poro, which conveys an odd feeling of unreality. এটা কিন্তু মাথায় রেখো, ডিটেকটিভের নেমিংটা ইজ এ ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট। একটা জুৎসই নাম কিন্তু দিতে হবে, হ্যাঁ। See, you cannot give something of a very common name. The detective has to be, identified by a unique name, right? So they are speculating about his profession, and he says he's a retired hairdresser. Look at that mustache of his, মানে এত চমৎকার মুস্টাস, আর এই মুস্টাসটা ইজ ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট। ইউ সি, তোমাদের একটা গল্প বলি এখানে। এই যে সিনেমাটা হচ্ছে, কেনেথ ব্রানা এই মার্ডার অন দ্য নাইল করছেন। হি অলসো ডিড, কেনেথ ব্রানা ইজ এ ভেরি ফেমাস অ্যাক্টর অফ মডার্ন টাইমস। ওকে যখন বলা হয়েছিল টু ডু দি মার্ডার অন দি ওরিয়েন্ট এক্সপ্রেস, কেনেথ ব্রানা হ্যাড অ্যাকচুয়ালি সর্ট অফ, মানে এরা তো মুস্টাসটা গ্রো করে বা লাগিয়ে রাখে, সো he grew that moustache, and to prevent that moustache from being disturbed, he actually slept in a special bag that was designed for him. মানে একটা মাথার উপরে একটা ব্যাগ ডিজাইন করা হয়েছিল so that he could breathe and the mustache would not be disturbed. So এই মুস্টাশটা কেন? See, Poro is very exact. মানে কোনো কিছু এই জায়গা থেকে ওই জায়গায় নড়বে না। আমি জানি না তোমাদের অনেকের মধ্যে হয়তো এই জিনিসটা আছে, না থাকলেও মানে ইউ হ্যাভ সিন পিপল যারা যারা কোনো জিনিসটাকে সব জিনিসটাকে সাজিয়ে রাখে, কোনো কিছু এদিক থেকে এক চুল ওদিক হতে পারে না, রাইট? Now this is a phenomenon which in medical terms is called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Poirot, if analyzed, psychologically analyzed, possesses OCD. He is for the exact order. So if anything is deviant, he will immediately pick it up, and that becomes a clue for him. So obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a scene in The Murder on the Orient Express to the Paro Dekho, where Poro is actually has to have his eggs all in one shape. অর্থাৎ সকালে উঠে ডিম খেলে ডিমগুলো কিন্তু সব একই রকম শেপের হতে হবে, মানে দে ক্যানট বি একটা ডিম একটু বড় একটা ডিম একটু ছোট হতে পারে, রাইট? সো এক্সাক্ট অর্ডার, দ্যাট ইজ হোয়াট Poirot নিডস. Why am I making all this? আমি এত বারবার করে এই কথাটা বলছি কেন? কারণ এর পিছনে you have to trace the ideology, right? You have to realize that the detective, or for the ideology of detective fiction, is the preservation of the status quo exactly as it is. The criminal violates the status quo, and once she violates the status quo, it must be restored to that earlier order. Punishment must be meted out so that that status quo must be maintained. So in a certain sense, therefore, the detective writer also suffers from an obsessive compulsive disorder. An obsessive compulsive disorder to restore society as it was. And therefore, in a certain sense, he is an extremely conservative writer in many ways. Agatha Christie, of course, was. Right? এই জিনিসটা কিন্তু তোমাদের বুঝতে হবে যে ক্যারেক্টারটাকে কিভাবে আমি বিল্ড আপ করবো. হাউ উইল আই বিল্ড আপ দ্য ডিটেক্টিভ? How will I make him distinct? And how will I make him an avenger of justice and somebody who is obsessed with detail and the conventional ideology? Right. So once again, let me come back. I am without defense. I cultivate the marrows. This morning, I enrage myself with these marrows. So you see, even his style of talking is slightly, French. He's speaking in an English which is not proper English in that sense of the term, and therefore slightly comic, right? And then he says, my work is to attain an object, the object gained me. And mark you, monsieur, my work was interesting work. And he says, what is his work? The study of human nature. এখানে মাথায় রেখো কিন্তু for the detective, you see, human nature is something that must be, as it were, analyzed as something predictable. Right? Even for Holmes, the human being is a specimen. He takes a distant view of the human being rather than a very sympathetic view. Right? Poirot, of course, is more sympathetic, but he views the human act or a crime rather dispassionately. Okay, so I had a friend, এই লেলটা খুব important, a friend who for many years never left my side, occasionally of an imbecility, bocamo, fool, to make one afraid. Nevertheless, he was very dear to me. সুতরাং he's talking about Hastings, his assistant, এবং দেখো, the detective is dismissing his assistant as somebody who is a fool. Figure to yourself that I miss even his stupidity. A stupidity is important because it is against this stupidity that the intelligence of the detective will be measured. His naivety, he's naive, he's innocent. His honest outlook the pleasure of delighting and surprising him by my superior gifts. All these I miss more than I can tell you. এই সেকশনটা তোমরা পারলে তুলে রেখো, because this defines the relationship between the detective and his assistant. অ্যাসিস্ট্যান্টকে একটু বোকা হতে হবে, অ্যাসিস্ট্যান্টকে একটু ইনোসেন্ট হতে হবে, অ্যাসিস্ট্যান্ট will not read into the situation, এবং the assistant will be amazed by the power of the detective. So the assistant is the surrogate reader. তুমি হচ্ছ সেই অ্যাসিস্ট্যান্ট, একটু বোকা, অবাক হয়ে যাচ্ছ, amazed হয়ে যাচ্ছ at the power of the detective. Right, so he lives in Argentina, and I cite Dr. Shepherd, Argentina যেতে চায়. I could have gone, I said, a year ago, but I was foolish and worse than foolish, greedy. I risked the substance for the shadow. You speculated, অর্থাৎ শেয়ার বাজারে খাটিয়ে টাকা খাটিয়ে ওর সব টাকা শেষ হয়ে গেছে। কিন্তু কোন টাকাটা শেষ হয়েছে? That's very important. Which money is this? This is the money which he had blackmailed from Mrs. Ferrers. অর্থাৎ ডিটেকটিভ কিন্তু একটা ক্লু দিয়ে দিলেন আগাথা ক্রিস্টি, যে ডক্টর শেফার্ড হ্যাজ স্পেকুলেটেড, ডক্টর শেফার্ডের একটা সোর্স অফ ইনকাম ছিল এবং সেই ইনকামটাকে উনি হারিয়েছিলেন, and he was pressing Mrs. Ferrers for more money, at which point of time she collapsed and committed suicide. অর্থাৎ এইখানে কিন্তু একটা ক্লু দেওয়া রইল, which clue will come back to us in the last part of the novel, right? And then this goes on. It was a foolish question that I put to you there, and indeed, and so on and so forth. I have made the acquaintance of a man who is in some ways resembles my far-off friend. So এখানে Dr. Shepherd becomes the Watson to Poirot. কিন্তু this is a far more complicated relationship. কারণ Dr. Shepherd is the murderer, খুনি। উনি জানেন, Dr. Shepherd knows that he's the murderer, and Poirot is placing him as his assistant. So in the way, in novel শেষে, the detective will actually find out his Watson as the murderer. Anyways, one prefers to remain incognito. I have not anxious for notoriety. I have not even troubled to correct the local version of my name. And then he asks about Peyton and Dr. and Roger Ackroyd, and so on and so forth. Right. So what I have sort of come up with today is the description of this place and the milieu, the first crime, or the first, let us say, death with which the novel starts, its importance, the narrator, unreliable narrator who turns out to be the murderer, and of course, the introduction of the detective and the speciality of Mr. Poirot. এর পরের দিন আমরা যেটা করব সেটা হচ্ছে the night of the murder and the police procedural that will follow. আমরা তিনটে ক্লাসে এই ইয়েটা করব, এই টেক্সটটা করব for all of us, হ্যাঁ, যাতে করে আমরা একটু টেক্সটটা দেখে নিতে পারি, and then we will of course go into a folding concluding discussion on the issues. আচ্ছা, এবার আমাকে একটা জিনিস বলো before all of you